If you have not been reading through the Bible, you haven't joined us yet, I highly encourage you to. How many have been reading through the Bible this year with us so far by show of hands? All right. And then how many have not been reading yet? Go ahead, confess. Encourage you to pick that plan up as we read 15 chapters a week. And if you can begin reading right where we are, you'll find that we'll talk about on the Sunday the passage that we'll be reading this week. But this morning we have a very special guest, inspiration for so many. David Barton is the founder of Wall Builders, which is a national pro-family organization that presents America's forgotten history and heroes, with an emphasis on the moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. And Wall Builders, of course, is that Old Testament book, Nehemiah, is that grassroots effort to rebuild a wall that had kept the people from worshiping. Really, that book is all about worship, but the people couldn't close the walls. They couldn't protect their homes or themselves, and especially they couldn't have that free ability to worship like they wanted to. And so they're building with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. And really, that's what Wall Builders is all about, named after, and it's seeking to energize the grassroots in our country today, just to get communities and states in our nation involved again, to realize what a wonderful country we've been given. And as we enter into this exciting election year, it's time to register. If you haven't, get involved. If you've not thought about running for office, how many have ever thought about running for office? Just thought about it. Just thought about it. Great. Well, you have an opportunity to do it today. We'll sign you up. Mingy gave that announcement at 1 o'clock today, but I encourage you to get all of David's books. I mean, if you haven't read them, I got one here. My wife's excited. This is for her. She teaches the American history class in the school, and this is American Story. It's the second part, and she's been using it for the curriculum. And what's amazing about Wall Builders and what David and Tim have done is they have in their library more of the founders' era, more founders' documents and letters and all those things that they write to each other. They have that in their personal library than the Library of Congress has. And so when I was a kid, I was told in my Christian educational books that the founders were mostly deists and they believed in a democracy. And I found out that's not true. They weren't deists, and they actually believed in a republic. It wasn't a democracy that they founded. Those words weren't used. And I learned all that from David Barton, amongst many other things. We were on a tour several years ago going through the Capitol in Washington, and David was leading a group of several pastors, and behind us was 3 senators. And he stopped and acknowledged the senators, and they said, thank you, David. We're just following because we want to learn more. Everything we've learned about our heritage has come from you. And so we're blessed to have him with us today, and I'm blessed to know that some of our county lawyers are watching so they can get an education on the country that they're supposed to be responsible for. But anyway, would you welcome with me David Barton?
Thanks, Pastor Mike. Always great to be with you. I want to start this morning with a Bible verse, a simple Bible verse. I hope it's not cooperating yet. There we go, guys. I hope that's not going to be me. But Revelation 1:5-6 says, "And Jesus Christ has made us kings and priests unto God and His Father." Pretty simple Bible verse. What does that verse mean? It's taken off on its own, guys. It is just going crazy here. Tim, I may need you to manually do stuff if you don't mind. So what does it mean to be a king and a priest? One of the things we know from the scriptures is oftentimes in the scriptures we go back to history to find what verses mean. For example, if you look at 1 Corinthians 10, as Paul is teaching the Corinthian church, at the first of that chapter he goes back through 6 different history lessons. He said, guys, here's what this means. And so you use history to be able to illustrate what's happening, what's going on. You see the same thing in Acts 7 as the New Testament church is being born. And you see the martyr of Stephen there. But in Stephen speaking to the Sanhedrin, he just goes through history lesson after history lesson, just repeating what God has done through history. So I want to do the same thing. What's it mean to be kings and priests? All right, Tim, it is going to take you, sir. There we go. it's kind of talking at times. We go to the story of the American founding. In the story of the American founding, you have the first colony that's founded is Jamestown. But Jamestown is not the only colony that's founded. There's another colony that's founded, and that second colony is that of Plymouth. And as you look at the two foundings, man, sorry guys, it's not cooperating. As you look at the two colonies, what you have there, you can refer to Charles Dickens' 1859 book, and it's called A Tale of Two Cities. And what you have in the founding of America is two very, very different stories. Now, what's happened is secular folks in America have picked up on Jamestown, and they call it the 1619 Project. And that 1619 Project is talking about Jamestown. Even though Jamestown was founded in 1607, 1619 is what they want everybody to think that America was. Well, that's part of the story, and they don't even get the story right, by the way, and they don't even try to. They say very clearly in their own writings that they're not trying to tell history. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create a different narrative. So literally, they're trying to rewrite America to something they wish it would be. That's unfortunately curriculum that's being taught in all 50 states now. It's the 1619 curriculum. But in looking back at the Tale of Two Cities, let me go first to the first colony. The first colony is that of Jamestown. And as you go to Jamestown, which is crazy. It's doing different things up here from what it is down here. I got three choices. Which choice do I want to make here, guys? And now I've got it two up there. So I've got four choices now. This is getting even better. And I could tell you the story, but literally if I can show you the pictures, it makes a lot more sense because I want you to understand, and as Mike said, we have two very large museums in Texas. If you ever get to Texas, come by and see us. We have tens of thousands of original documents, things that go from Columbus all the way through the space age. And by the way, with you guys being so much involved in technology in this part of the United States, let me just give you a quick story as they're getting this all fixed. If I take you back to the start of the space program, it starts with one-man capsules. We're trying to get in space, kind of keep up with Sputnik, what the Russians have done. And so we have the Mercury project, 7 different missions, and just one guy in capsule go up, maybe stay 2 or 3 hours. Maybe after 2 or 3 hours, there'll be an orbit or two, but it's not long. Then we get to Gemini, which is 2 people in the capsule. So we're expanding this space program, what we can do. And then we get into the Apollo project because President JFK goes to Rice and says, hey, let's put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So that's where the Apollo project starts. You've got 3 guys because at some point in time, you're going to have a lunar module that goes and lands on the moon. So 2 guys there and 1 guy circling the moon to be able to reattach when they come back and get back. So in the first 7 missions for Apollo, what it is figuring out how do we do 3, what can we do, let's work on some practice sessions. And when you get to Apollo 8, this is when we now go to the moon. We don't land on the moon, we go to the moon, we circle the moon. And Borman is one of the 3 astronauts there, and they happen to be circling the moon on Christmas. And what they do is to give a Christmas screen back to America, they read the creation story out of Genesis. And so they go through the creation story, and it's great, except Madalyn Murray O'Hara, if you know that name, she's a famous atheist. Madalyn Murray O'Hara sues NASA. You can't have a Bible verse out public, and so sue NASA. And so they continue on with Apollo 9, Apollo 10, and Apollo 11 is when we're going to put somebody on the moon. We make 3 trips to the moon, going around it. Now we're going to land and put somebody there. And you've got Buzz Aldrin is the second guy, and Neil Armstrong is the first. And if you'll listen to the communications coming out of NASA, they get there, they land, the Eagle's down safely. Charlie Duke is Capcom back at NASA, and he's talking to them. And they talk for a while and make sure everything's right. And then he goes silent for quite a period of time. You go, what happened to that? Why did he go silent? Well, they went silent because before they got off on the moon, what they did was they stopped and had communion because they thought that was the appropriate thing to do. And so Buzz Aldrin was actually having communion with this church back in Houston, but NASA said, don't say that on the air because Madalyn Murray O'Hara will sue us again. So go ahead and have communion when you land on the moon, dedicated to the Lord, but just don't do it on air. And so that happened with Apollo 9 or Apollo 11. Now, what happened back at Apollo 1, Ed White was one of the original astronauts. He was burned up on the pad. The entire crew was. They were doing practice exercise things, and they had an explosion and fire on the pad. And at that point in time, a bunch of NASA employees said, you know, this is really dangerous stuff. So they created what's called the Apollo Prayer League. The Apollo Prayer League said, we're going to pray. What do we got? All right. Apollo Prayer League said, we're going to pray for everything that's going on with Apollo. And so they were praying for every Apollo mission. Well, Ed White had wanted to get Bibles on the moon. He'd wanted to take Bibles on the moon. And so they said, by Apollo 13, let's put Bibles on the moon, fulfill what Ed wanted. And Apollo 13 had 100 Bibles going to the moon. What happened was they had the explosion in space. They didn't make it. They made it back to Earth, but not to the moon. So they put 100 Bibles on Apollo 14 and took to the moon. They built an altar on the moon. They left a Bible on the moon. 99 of those Bibles came back. We've actually got 3 of the Bibles that landed on the moon. So anything related to history you're going to find there. So let me pick up from where we are here. 1607 is when Jamestown gets started. Jamestown gets started when they came ashore and landed in Virginia. What they did was they landed at a place called Cape Henry. They erected a cross at Cape Henry, and that cross they knelt down and they dedicated this new land to the Lord Jesus Christ. If you doubt that, all you have to do is read the 1606 Charter of Virginia. 1606 Charter says very simply, we've done this because it tends to the glory of God's divine majesty and propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God. No question, these people who landed in Virginia were evangelical Christians. There's also no question at all they were not biblical Christians. Now, it's interesting. Can you be an evangelical and not be biblical? Absolutely, yes. And I'm going to show you how that works. And America today has a whole lot of evangelicals that are not biblical, and there's a big difference between the two. If you look at Jamestown and look at who they are, I mentioned the 1619 Project. They picked Jamestown and said, this is the founding of America. This is what America is all about. This is what defined America. No. They picked that because what happened in Jamestown, that's the colony that had slavery. And so slavery, this is what's defined race in America is Jamestown. There's a whole lot more than that. And by the way, there was a whole lot more than slavery that was wrong with Jamestown. With history, you should always tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are certainly bad things that happened with Jamestown. There's good things, but there's plenty of bad things. And if you look at the people in Jamestown, they came from Europe. And being in Europe, every government in Europe at that time was run by a king or queen. And being run by a king or queen, that meant the king or queen owned everything. You didn't have private property. They could take it from you and give it to somebody else. If you did something really good in war, they'd give you an estate or land or whatnot. You worked for the government. You worked for the king and queen. They would give you what they thought you needed, but everything was with them. And so that is what we would define as a socialistic system. You didn't have private capital. You didn't have private enterprise, private things. It was all for the government. So what happens is these people that land in Jamestown, they are in a socialistic system, and they're used to thinking that way. They're used to the government doing everything, and they do everything for the government. And so they've landed here, and the king's going to send them supplies. They got a charter, and they're over here for the king. And the king will send them supplies, except the king doesn't do a good job of that because this is not a big, important colony. This is a couple hundred people. He's got colonies all around the globe, and he doesn't think of these guys that often. And so what happens is they don't get food as often as they should, but fortunately for them, they have Indian neighbors that are very good. Indians were very good to them, and the Indians would bring them food. And for the first 2 years, part of the way they survived was that the king didn't regularly send them the food they needed, and the Indians were very good to them, and the Indians shared what they had, and et cetera. And at that point in time, the governor then was John Smith. And John Smith, the governor, said, this is not good. This is not reliable. This is not what we ought to do. He actually quoted from 2 Thessalonians 3:10. He said, here's the new policy of the colony. I'm governor. If you don't work, you don't eat. You got to work. You got to produce. You got to be productive. And they didn't like that, so they tried to blow him up. So he actually had to go back to England. He got burned in a gunpowder explosion. So they got rid of the governor. So now we can go back to do what we've been doing. And so as they approach their third year, and they get into the third year, the Indians at that point say, look, we can't keep supplying you with stuff. We're having trouble staying alive ourselves. It's plenty tough in the wilderness out here, and we just can't keep giving you stuff. You're on your own. Well, they hadn't been producing. They hadn't been working. They're relying on the government to send them everything, and they don't get everything they need. And so what happens, that third winter, they get into what's called the starving time. Starving time is the winter of 1609, 1610. And as they entered that starving time winter, they entered it with a total of 490 colonists. They came out of the winter with only 60 colonists left. 430 people starved to death in that winter. And it was pretty barbaric. They don't have food. They haven't been working. They haven't put stuff up. They don't have stuff set aside. And so what happens is they running out of food, they get hungry, and so you start looking for stuff to eat. And you'll find frogs or snakes or bugs or whatever, and that doesn't last long. So let's kind of move up the food scale here. Let's go to cats and dogs, or pets, if you will. And that doesn't last long. Well, we're going to have to eat our livestock, our horses and our cows, and that doesn't get them through the winter. It gets really bad. But they're burying a lot of people who are dead. And somebody says, wait a minute, we're putting people in the ground who still have meat on their bones. They went to the cemetery, dug up the corpses to eat the meat off the corpses they'd already buried. It got so bad that one man murdered his pregnant wife and ate her. And of course, he was executed for that. And then they ate him after they executed him. So, I mean, it's bad all the way around. So you get through that, and the next year after they get out of the winter, they start Indian wars. We're going to make the Indians bring us food. We're the king's subject, and they're living on the king's land, and they're the king's subject, and they've got to bring, and so they've got this really bad mentality on it. And they even kidnapped Pocahontas to use that as a bargaining chip. We'll hold Pocahontas, and you keep bringing us food. As long as you keep bringing us food, we won't harm Pocahontas. So it's this hostage-taking thing. They just had so many bad ideas in so many ways, but they came out of that attitude of Europe. And in Europe, they had the same elitism, same socialism, same pro-slavery. They were big government. They were group conscious. You see, over in Europe, you have the aristocracy and the lords and the nobles and the businessmen, and then you have the workers and the common men and the yeomen, and then you got the slaves. So you have all these different classes, and that's the way they did Jamestown. It was just like living in Europe, except it was over in the New World. So as you look at the guys from Jamestown, there's no question that there's a lot of stuff to criticize in Jamestown. Now, they got some stuff right, too, but there's plenty to criticize. The 1619 Project only criticizes the slavery part of it. There's lots of others. But that is not the only settlement in America. We could call it the 1620 Project. So they use 1619 because they say that's when slavery got started, and they're wrong on that. But nonetheless, 1620, that's the Pilgrims. And when you look at the 1620 Project, this is going back to the original two colonies that Charles Dickens' book, 1859, is a tale of two cities. Here's the other city. Here's the other side of the coin they don't talk about. When you go to these guys, the Pilgrims, interesting thing, nearly every picture you see of the Pilgrims, you will find them gathered around a Bible. And historically, that's the way they were. These were people of the book. They were Bible people. And so what's happening is they are a congregation coming to America. They're not a bunch of settlers looking for some kind of settlement. They are a congregation. They've been persecuted and driven out of England. They've gone to Holland. England even went into Holland, drive them out of Holland. So they are a church congregation coming to America. They're coming on two ships. One of the ships, the Speedwell, has trouble and is not able to make it. The Mayflower is the one that does make it. But their pastor, John Robinson, was talking to them. And their pastor said, look, we've been living by the Bible. And if I can back up for just a minute here to that Bible they're holding is called the world's first pocket Bible. You see how big that is? It's because the Bibles prior to this were called pulpit Bibles. They were 4 times as large, and they were chained to the pulpit of churches. You could not take one home with you. You could go to the church and read it. And since it didn't matter what you read, you're going to do what the king says because we have state-established religions. Why read the book anyway? Because if you interpret it wrong, he's going to persecute you, put you in jail, whatever. This is the first one they could haul with them. As they got into this book, they said, man, have we been doing it wrong for 1,000 years? And so this is what they used to really reform the culture and do things biblically, move in a different direction. And so what happened is they're leaving. Their pastor, John Robinson, says, when you get over to that new world, don't do things the way we've been doing it here in Europe. Take with you the new light of the gospel and do the things in a different way. Follow the Bible. And so that's their plan. And so as they come over, they arrive off the coast of America. They arrive and they write what's called the Mayflower Compact. This is the first civil document done in American history. It, too, is very evangelical. When you read it, it says right up top, it says, having undertaken for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, a voyage to plant the first colony in the north. We've done this for God and for Christ and for Christians. We're doing this. That's the motivation. So they too are very evangelical. There's no question that they're evangelical, but you can see how it works out because they had a knowledge of the Bible that the people in Jamestown did not have. They didn't study the Bible. You know, Mike's talking about reading the Bible every 2 years. That is a practice you should do, and I'm going to show you examples of that later on. So with the Mayflower Compact, they said, okay, Pastor said not to take the darkness of Europe with us, and one area that is in government, because in Europe they have only the monarchical form of government, and socialistic is kind of a dictatorship. We want something different. So what are we going to do? Because when you look at the Bible illustrates 7 different forms of government in the Bible, and which one do we want? And so what they said is, well, we like what we see with the very first government that God created, the Hebrew Republic. When God took them out of Egypt and took them out the desert, got them Mount Sinai, he gave them 613 laws, gave them a complete code of law for how to run the nation. It was economics, it was marriage, it was consanguinity, it was education, everything you need to know. Immigration, it's all in those 613 laws. And that's where we see our first government set up. And so we think that's the model. So Exodus 18:21 became important because in Exodus 18:21 it says, choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Oh, have elections. Have elections over, we would say, local, county, state, and federal, tens, 50s, hundreds. It says have elections and choose able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, men who will rule in the fear of God. That's your qualifications for office. So they said, okay, let's have elections. That's a good thing to do. And so they come up with an elective government. But the question is, Bible doesn't tell us how often to have elections. How often should we elect officials? And they decided, let's do it every year. So they had annual elections. You elected your governor every year. One of the early governors, William Bradford, served for a total of 30 terms as governor. Well, the terms are only 1 year long, so he served 30 years as governor, which is still impressive. So they did that. They said, but you know, the other thing that we see in the Bible that's really clear is the separation of institutions. Because if you go back to when God created the Hebrew Republic there in Exodus, God laid everything out. He said, Moses, you're over the civil stuff, and Aaron, you're over the temple stuff. Now, both of those belong to God. There was no secular stuff there. They're both God's, but he put separate leaders over both of them. And you have King Uzziah and 2 Chronicles 26, who's a king that's blessed by God. God prospers him. God helps him in so many ways. His animal husbandry, his agriculture, the economics, the military, it's just phenomenal stuff. And the king says, I'm going to go in the temple and offer sacrifices to God to thank him for how much he's blessed the country. The priest met him at the door and said, no, you will not. God ordained the priest to do the sacrifices. You're not a priest. You don't go in. And he said, I'm a king. Don't ever tell me what I can and can't do. And so he went in to offer the sacrifices, and God struck him down at the altar. He went out. He had leprosy. He died shortly thereafter. God made it really clear that I have two separate institutions. But what we've had since the time of 390 A.D., Emperor Theodosius set up the first state-established church. In 390 A.D., Emperor Theodosius, who was the emperor of the world, the Roman Empire, whole world, he became a Christian in 390 A.D. Good for him. And then he made an announcement. He said, I'm now a Christian. Every one of you will become a Christian or I'm going to kill you. And that was his announcement. And that is the first state-established church where that the government is telling you what your religion is going to be and how to practice it. See, that's the way it was for the next 1,000 years. The pilgrims say that's not the model God gave. He put a separate person over each of those, and that's what they did. So what they did was they established both civil and religious leaders running things. Each jurisdiction had its own. Neither one was secular. God was in both of them, but they had separate leaders over the two of it. And so as a result, that ended the state-established church. For 1,300 years, we've had state-established churches, and these guys end it. And as a result of ending it, that's where you find things like rights of conscience and religious toleration. This is part of the heritage we have from the pilgrims. If you go past that with the pilgrims, free enterprise system, because they too were socialists when they got here. Their governor, William Bradford, said, we came as a congregation. We were like Acts 2:41, 42, where we had everything in common. We shared because we're all one congregation. We're not a political gathering. We're a church gathering. But he said, but you know what? We had the same problem everybody else had. We had lazy people among us who didn't want to work hard because regardless of what they do, they're going to get the same portion everybody else has. So it encouraged non-productivity, and it made it much harder for the productive because they're having to produce for everybody. So they quoted the same Bible verse John Smith used, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, that if you don't work, you don't eat, but they went further. Also relied on 1 Timothy 5:8. The Bible says if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an infidel. You've denied the faith. And they said, hey, that's really clear. So what they did was they divided the land. They had private property, divided up, said, okay, that's your land. You make it produce, or you're going to go hungry this year. It's up to you. They took the orphans and widows, and they took care of the orphans and widows like James 1:26 tells us to do, but they set up this system. And so that created the first free market business in nearly 1,000 years in the world. By 1627, they had a free market business set up in Massachusetts, and Governor Bradford said that by the time Within 2 years of the time they set that up, their productivity had increased sevenfold in the colony. It went through the roof. They never again had a time of want in the colony. They use several other Bible passages. You know about all the teachings Jesus does, economic parables, Matthew 25, Luke 19, Matthew 20, all these passages about economics. They set up an economic system that became the most prosperous in the world, hadn't had the free market in 1,000 years. These guys brought it in. You also find from them what they did with private property, because they landed in Massachusetts in December, and that's a lousy time to land in Massachusetts in December, and they didn't have any place to go, and they need a place to stay, and they need to build homes, but they don't know where they can get property because they can't find any. They didn't see a single Indian at all, no Native Americans, so they went ashore at a place where there was nothing was built there. It was just wild wilderness. There was nothing there, and they started building. And so they're building, but they're still concerned about who owns the land, what do we do with that? And so the next spring, as they're coming into spring, an Indian named Samoset comes walking into their camp. And lo and behold, he speaks English. Now, how in the world did you get somebody who speaks English with the guys over here? And as far as they know, there's never been anybody over here. And they try to communicate, and it's a little rough. And he says, hey, hang on. I know somebody who speaks English better than I do. So he went and returned with Squanto. Now, Squanto had been stolen years before. He was taken off the coast. He was sold in Spain as a slave in Spain. I think it was 27 Native Americans had been captured, taken to Spain, and sold in slavery. And some Catholic priests saw that and said, that's not right. So they bought these guys, they freed them. And so what happened was Squanto went over to England, went across the bay to England, and he spent several years in England. He learned the English language. He learned how English people think. He learned their customs. And he came back, and his people had been wiped out in the meantime. While he was gone, there was a plague that came in, killed everybody except him. And so he doesn't have anything in life to do except teach these guys how to live over here, because they don't have a clue what they're doing. But he speaks their language, he knows their thinking, their customs. And so they're concerned about, hey, who owns the land? We're living here, we don't know if we have permission to, what do we do with that? And so they end up meeting Chief Massasoit. Chief Massasoit is the chief of all the Confederation tribes in that part of New England area. And so they end up purchasing the land from him, and it was a mutually satisfactory deal for both sides. The Pilgrims agreed to it, and the Indians agreed to it, and it was really good. And you'll find that that's the way that it was for a good bit of time. As a matter of fact, even 2 generations later, if you go to Governor Josiah Winslow, this is in 1875, 1876, he points out, he says, I think I can clearly say that the English did not possess 1 foot of land in this colony but what was fairly obtained by honest purchase of the Indian proprietors. We don't have a square foot of land that we don't have a title deed to, and it was an agreement that both sides agreed to and both sides liked. You'll find that was the longest lasting treaty in American history between Anglos and Native Americans, was what the Pilgrims did. And when that treaty was finally broken more than a half century later, it was the Indians who broke the treaty, not the Pilgrims who broke the treaty. But the concept of private property, see, that's not part of the English concept with the king and queen. All the property is mine. There's no private property. I'll give it to you, and I'll take it back if I don't like the way you use it. That's real different. Pilgrims came in with private property because that's a biblical teaching. 2 of the 10 commandments deal with private property. Don't take somebody else's private property. Don't even want somebody else's private property. So God's very strong on private property. Pilgrims also, with civil rights, they lived in a world that at that point in time, every country practiced slavery. So, slavery is not a new thing that came to America with Jamestown. Slavery had been in the world for centuries and for millennia. It was common. But the Pilgrims did something different with it. You see, in 1641, the Pilgrims dealt with the issue of slavery, and they did so out of the Bible, because these are people who are spending time in the book. They look in the book, and if you read their codes, and this is code I'm going to show you, quotes from Exodus 21:16. This is the actual code, and you can see they spell things differently than we do now, but that was Old English. So if you look in the middle, number 10, it says, if any man stealeth a man or mankind, he shall be put to death. They called slavery man-stealing. You went somewhere, you stole a man, you brought him over here, and you sold him. That is man-stealing, and according to Exodus 21:16, that is capital offense. You can't, that's really, really bad. So that's the law they passed in 1641. By the way, notice there are other laws. The one above it, if any man shall forcibly and without consent ravish any maid or woman that is lawfully married or contracted, he shall be put to death. Deuteronomy 22. Number 11, if any man rise up by false witness willingly and purpose to take another man's life, he should be put to death. Deuteronomy. This is the moral code. This is the legal code. God said these are crimes that will destroy a community, and you don't put up with this kind of stuff. You have to get this evil out of the community. So that's where you have a lot of the civil codes that came. It was in this book. And so what happened was in 1646, a slave ship came in. Now, they passed this law, no slaves, no man stealing. In 1646, a slave ship comes in. The captain gets off. The officers get off. They go into Plymouth and say, guys, we are here, and we have a load of slaves. Who needs slaves? We got all you can use. Who? And they just start into slave. And the Pilgrims go, you've got what? You've got slaves? The Pilgrims arrested the captain, arrested the officers, and sentenced them all to death for man stealing. Now, the captain says, whoa, 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 whoa. You guys don't do slaves? Everybody does slaves. We've never been to a place that doesn't do slaves. We didn't know you guys didn't do slaves. If we had known it, we wouldn't have come here. Pilgrims, point taken. You didn't know, but now you do. We'll let you go now, but if you ever return with a load of slaves, we know that you knew, and you'll be executed at that point. So the Pilgrims, the ship goes off, but the Pilgrims retain the slaves. They don't send them back with the slave because he'll sell them somewhere else. So the Pilgrims then take up a contribution from among them. They go hire another ship. They hire a captain, and they do that, and they tell the slaves, says, wherever you were stolen from, we'll take you back to wherever you were. So just let us know where you want, and the captain will take you. They did everything they could to make it right, even though they were not responsible for the wrong that happened. That's the Pilgrims. See, that's what happened. That's where the anti-slavery side begins, and that's really big up north, like with Massachusetts, for example. If you look, this is an editorial cartoon out of a newspaper, Massachusetts newspaper in 1792. They called this the Equality Ball, 1792. 1792, that's Founding Father time, yeah. On the left side, the guy with his hand out with the black jacket is Governor John Hancock, signer of the Declaration, President of Continental Congress. He's shaking hands with a black man. That black man is named Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey is the wealthiest black man in America at the time. He and his sons own a global shipping business out of Massachusetts. They send ships all over the world. And he and John Hancock are celebrating the fact that in Massachusetts, blacks and whites are equal. Matter of fact, Robert Brown Elliott, who went on to be a U.S. congressman, he decades later said, there never was a time in Massachusetts history when blacks and whites weren't equal. Well, that's not the 1619 Project, and this is not what people hear today. They hear 1619 Project, which again is lousy history. They don't even get it right, but this is the part we don't hear. And so what we hear is, oh, it's a whole bunch of white guys who founded America. And I look at that picture, and that is a bunch of white guys. And by the way, since we didn't have cameras, why did we have paintings of them? Because paintings were expensive. To paint someone, you had to hire an artist. And now, artists would do paintings of people who were really famous. So if you're a governor, they'll do a painting of you. And if you're the head of a university, they'll do a painting of you. And if you're a great military guy, they'll do a painting of you. And if you signed the Declaration of the Constitution, they'll do a painting of you. But you got to be really famous. Isn't it interesting? We have so many paintings from back in that day of all these black heroes as well. Now, why did they get painted? Because they did stuff really famous. But we don't know anything about that today. As a matter of fact, if you start with the guy who's pulling up right now on the right, that's Jack Sisson. Go across the bottom row to the left, that's John Chavez. That's Lemuel Haynes. That's Absalom Jones, the guy on horseback. His name is Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was in New Hampshire. And in 1768, Wentworth Cheswell, a black man, was elected to office in a white community in New Hampshire in 1768. He was reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions in New Hampshire. He's considered the father of their public schools, the father of their library system. Very significant guy. A black man elected office in 1768. Yeah, but that's not a first. Go all the way back to 1641. If you go back to 1641, a man named Matthias D'Souza, he lived in Maryland. He's a black man living in Maryland. The white community in Maryland elects him to the state legislature. 1641, we have a black man elected in America as a state legislator. Yep. And by the time you get to 1876, there had been more than 1,000 blacks elected to office in America. And we got lots of pictures of these guys. It's just that nobody shows them anymore today. And so we can say, oh, there was none of that went on in America. Yes, there is. All those paintings I showed you. As a matter of fact, let me put this in context with the world. Do you know when the first black, now remember, 1641, we elected black to office in America, first one. When's the first black elected to office in Great Britain? 1987. How about Italy? 2010. And we've been electing blacks to office since 1641, and we're the bad nation in the world? How does this happen? It happens because we don't even know our own history. And that goes back much to the Pilgrims. We're just historically illiterate. We don't even know what the Pilgrims did with civil rights and what they did with the other side of the story, the tale of two cities. We get the Jamestown Project and none of the rest of it. In the same way, if I take you to public education, the Pilgrims came over and they brought their kids with them because they are living here. This is where they'll spend the rest of their life, and all of their future is going to be here. And they're concerned about their kids having an education. So you find that these guys passed the first public education law in America. It's in the Code of 1650, and that first public education law is called the Old Deluder-Satan Act, which is a really interesting name for a public school law. Why would they call it that? They said because it's the one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures. As they have, Satan's number one project is to keep you from reading the Bible. If he can do that, he can get you to buy all sorts of stuff that God doesn't want, stuff that won't be good for you. That's what's done in Europe. They didn't read the Bible. The king told them what the Bible said. Said, look, Satan's number one purpose is to keep us from knowing God's word, and we ain't letting that happen here. So what they did was they established a law that every 50 kids you get in a community, you have to get them a teacher. Every 100 kids in a community, you have to build them a school. This is the first public school law in America. Now, significantly, because they wanted all kids to know the Bible, they educated both boys and girls. It's a striking thing that this backwoods colony, this remote wilderness colony of Massachusetts, they had the highest literacy rate for women of any area in the world, higher than Spain or France or England. All those enlightened nations had a higher literacy rate for women in Massachusetts because everybody needs to know the Bible. Everybody needs to be able to read. It's significant that if you look across the history of education, you'll find lots of documents. You guys in California, you're like us in Texas. You're a Mexican territory, then you became a republic, then you became a state. We all have records. You can go back and you can look at California's territorial records on education, the same with the republic and same with the state, and you can see how many kids you had in a certain community, how many schools they had, how many teachers. It's all records. And I want to take you back to New Jersey because I did this. I just chose some states, went to New Jersey, looking to see what their schools are. I want to show you New Jersey schools in 1816. This is about 2 centuries after the Pilgrims. And so they have the annual report, the state board, their publishers, their annual report, and they were talking about what kids in the first and second grades were doing. Now, we would call it first and second grades. They called it first and second classes. Let me just read you the report. Here's the public report. It says, all the scholars of the first and second classes commit to memory portions of the New Testament or Psalms, a lesson of the Catechism, several hymns, and the text of the preceding Sabbath. Oh, public schools in New Jersey, if you're in first and second grade, everybody does that. And by the way, what are the texts of the preceding Sabbath? Any Bible verse that Mike mentioned last week, we spent this week memorizing that verse. So if he read chapters, if he referenced verses as he's talking, whatever verse, that's the text of the preceding Sabbath. That's probably worth something doing now. Write down the verses you hear or don't recognize. Just, I think that's in the Bible. Look it up. Memorize it, because that's what all the kids in New Jersey were doing with first and second classes. And like we all know these guys, there's always kids that are smarter than all the others. There's always those kind of kids. And they talked about one of the kids. They said one of the scholars, now remember, first and second grade, one of the scholars has committed to memory the book of John and the first 30 Psalms together with the 119th Psalm. First and second grade, yeah, but he's a smart kid. Look what the rest of them did. They said the majority have committed to memory the Gospel by John. Every first and second grader memorized the Gospel of John in public schools in New Jersey. Now, there was one kid who did an extra 30 chapters out of Psalm and Psalm 119, but everybody memorized the Gospel. I'm not going to ask, show of hands, just curiosity. I wonder how many people have memorized the Gospel of John. Maybe someday we can be as smart as those first graders in New Jersey in 1816. This is public education, 1816. So we have that. We go back to the Pilgrims for that. And by the way, it was this way across the other states. I can show you the similar reports. Due process is where the Massachusetts colony can probably get bad rap. This is where in our textbooks, Christian or secular, we talk about the intolerant Christians, because these guys came here to practice their faith, and then they started killing people who disagreed with them, the witch trials. Okay, we had witch trials. Now, like slavery, we're not the only place who had witch trials. There were trials going across the world, but for the American witch trials, they happened in Massachusetts. Just out of curiosity, we know it's a bad deal. We know that should not have happened. The questions we don't ask and answer anymore is how many were put to death, which is 27, how long did the trials last, which is 18 months, nor do we ask the question of why did the trials stop. And that's all important because the whole world was having trials at the time. So was America different from the rest of the world, or were we the same? Were we worse? Interesting, why did the trial stop? It's because 3 Christian leaders, the Reverend John Wise, Reverend Increase Mather, and Layman Thomas Brattle went to Governor Phipps and said, Phipps, what you're doing here, you're just copying Europe. Europe is doing this, and you're copying them, and this is not what the Bible says. And they showed him scripturally what the Bible said, due process and criminal justice. And Phipps looked at that and said, you are right. Oh, this is bad. And he called in Judge Samuel Sewell, who was over the trials. He said, Sewell, we got to stop the trials. This is not right. What they did, they recognized what they did was wrong, and they called for a colony-wide day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, seeking to avert God's judgment because they've shed innocent blood, and they know they have. And that's a judgeable offense in the Bible. We got to get God's mercy on this. They then took all the people that were convicted and said, you know, these people were wrongly convicted, and now they've been tainted. They went back in the law books and pulled the names off the law books so that those people wouldn't be identified with crimes because they shouldn't have been convicted of those crimes because it wasn't done in a biblical process. They also then paid restitution to all the families directly involved in the atrocities that the state had committed on them. So significantly, part of the story we don't hear about, but this is where due process rights really come from. Now, I mentioned that witch trials were going across the world at the time. Witch trials across the rest of the world lasted more than a century. Do you know how many people were killed in the witch trials in the rest of the world? Over 500,000. 27 in America. How come every textbook in America will mention the 27 but not the 500,000? We're happy to make America look as bad as we can, and America's got plenty of bad. Again, we should tell the good, the bad, the ugly. There's plenty there, but there's also a lot of good. Today it's all the bad and the ugly and none of the good. So you look at what's happened there, and it's significant because are they really the intolerant Christians? Maybe they're the really advanced guys because they brought this stuff to an end and they did everything they could to make it right where they had done something wrong. And so they set a whole different pattern for the rest of the world. Now, this is where due process rights come from. And if you know the Bill of Rights, the 4th through the 8th Amendment Bill of Rights, that's our due process rights. So the right to confront your accuser, the right to compel witnesses in your behalf, the right to speak in your own defense, etc. That's in the Bill of Rights. That's the due process rights. Now, I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think in my lifetime, the most secular, and probably going all the way back to the founding, as far as I can tell historically, the most secular justice we've ever had on the court was Stephen Breyer. Now, he's the most recent retiree of the court, but it's interesting. I was reading one of Breyer's decisions, and in that he said, well, we all know that the due process rights came out of the Bible. Really? We all know that? And so I looked to see what his footnote was. And in his footnote, he referenced volume 30 of Federal Practice and Procedure. Now, this is the federal law books. If you practice federal law, it's a series of law books that go from here out the door and in the parking lot. It's just a huge series. Volume 30 of Federal Practice and Procedure has 20 pages on how the Bible shaped the due process rights. For example, what you find, those due process rights, you'll find that according to the Federal Practice and Procedure in John 8:10, that's where you get the right to confront your accuser. Proverbs 18:17, that's where you get the right to compel witnesses. You have compel witnesses in your own behalf, give the other side of the story. You have verses like Acts 22:1 where you get to speak in your own defense. This stuff comes out of the Bible. Most people have no clue that those due process rights came out of the Bible, but that goes all the way back to the Pilgrims, what the Pilgrims did. So when you see what the Pilgrims did, it's significant because I mentioned virtually every picture you see of the Pilgrims, you're going to see the Bible. Look at that. Every one of them have a Bible with them. They weren't waiting for someone to teach them the Bible. They all studied and read the Bible themselves. And that's significant. And they were called the people of the book. So if you go back to that comparison, these guys are evangelicals, but they're also biblical. Jamestown was evangelical, but they were not biblical at all. It's good to be an evangelical, good to have a relationship with Christ. A whole lot better to know his word once you have that relationship with Christ. It's knowing the word that makes the difference. It's not having just the relationship. You've got to know the word and apply the word, and that's the difference that you see between Jamestown and the Pilgrims. So when you go back to comparing the 1620 project, and you look at that Bible verse we started with, and Jesus Christ is made of kings and priests unto God and his Father. And what's that mean? Well, if you go to the Pilgrims, they were capable of being kings and priests. They had elections every year out of themselves. So they can say, okay, you be pastor this year and you be governor this year. Now, that's because they read the Bible. They were competent to be civil leader. Every one of you should be capable of conducting a Bible study or conducting a precinct meeting in politics. You need to be kings and priests. We need to know that. He has made us kings and priests. See, for Jamestown, those guys, they weren't competent being kings or priests. They had to import their preaching. And they had some good preachers. Alexander Whitaker and Hunt and other pastors they had were great, but they had to import them. They couldn't raise them from among themselves. And the same thing with their governors. They had to have those imported as well. So I challenge you to do that thing out of Revelation. You need to be a king and a priest. And we have examples of what that looks like. That's the only way the government works the way it's supposed to. You have to do it according to God's word and God's principles. It makes all the difference. If this is new to you, I encourage you. We got books out front that'll take you through all of this. God bless you guys.